Number 10 says, which expression results in a rational number? So a rational number is any number that can be written as a ratio of two integers, a over b, where a and b are both integers, and b cannot be equal to 0. And if you'll notice, all of these choices, they have some square root in them. They're either taking a number and adding it to a square root, or subtracting, or multiplying, or dividing. So, and we are looking for a rational number. So which will result in the rational number. So first we're going to kind of review perfect squares. So perfect squares, so for example, if I look on a number line, and I'll take 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so the number 6 is the same thing as the square root of 36, right? Because any number times itself, 6 times 6 is equal to 36. 5 is the same thing as the square root of 25. 4 is the same thing as the square root of 16. 3 is the same thing as the square root of 9. 2 is the same as the square root of 4. 1 is the same as the square root of 1. And 0 is the same thing as the square root of 0. So all of these numbers underneath the radical, these are all called perfect squares. 0, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, so on. Those are called perfect squares because if you take the square root of that number, you get a whole number. The square root of 25, you get 5. So for example, if you take the square root of a number that is not a perfect square, so I'm going to take 14. The square root of 14 is in between the square root of 9 and the square root of 16. So it would be somewhere in here, the square root of 14. The square root of 14 is not a whole number. The square root of 14 is not 3. The square root of 14 is not 4. It's somewhere in between those two numbers. So the square root of 14 is an irrational number. This is irrational. If I take another number, for example, I'll take a number between 1 and 4, so I'll take 3. The square root of 3 is in between the square root of 1 and the square root of 4. This again would be an irrational number. Where these numbers that are perfect squares, the square root of 16, that's rational. Square root of 25 is rational. Square root of 36 is rational, right? So again, a number that's not a perfect square, when I take the square root of it, not a perfect square, 3 is not a perfect square. When I take the square root of that, I get an irrational number. 14 is not a perfect square. When I take the square root of that, it's irrational. So in this problem, if it says, which expression results in a rational number, well, 1.5 is an irrational number because the square root of 1.5 is irrational because 1.5 is not a perfect square. So when I take the square root of that, I'm going to get a decimal that goes on forever and doesn't repeat. So this is a rational number, 1.5, and I'm adding that to an irrational number. So a rational plus an irrational is I'm going to end up with an irrational number. So letter B, 12 is a rational number. That's the same thing as 12 over 1. It's a terminating decimal. And I'm subtracting the square root of 12, which is an irrational number. Because again, 12 is not a perfect square. So when I take the square root of a number that's not a perfect square, I get an irrational number. So a rational minus an irrational is also going to be irrational. Letter C, 3/4 is a rational number times the square root of 3/4. Again, 3 is not a perfect square. 4 is a perfect square, but when I take the square root of that 3, that's going to be irrational. So I'm taking a rational times an irrational, which is going to give me an irrational. And then the last one, D, 25 is a rational number because it's a whole number. You can write it as 25 over 1. It's a terminating decimal. You're dividing it by the square root of 25. But the square root of 25, remember, The square root of 25 is the same thing as 5. That's a rational number. So you're taking a rational divided by a rational, which is going to be a rational. Because this problem is really just 25 divided by the square root of 25, which is 5. So that's really all you're doing is taking 25 divided by 5. So my answer on this one would be D. That's going to give me a rational number. When I take a rational divided by a rational, it's going to equal another rational number, where all these others resulted in an irrational number. So the answer is D.